Hi, hello, and welcome to this Duty to Question podcast by the Evidence-Based Social Work Alliance, EBSWA. EBSWA was established 6 years ago, or over 6 years ago, in 2019, to speak up for an evidence-based approach to sex and gender identity in social work, which had at that point completely disappeared. My name's Maggie Mellon. I'm an independent social worker in Scotland, and I'm joined by our guest speaker, Alice Sullivan, who is a professor of sociology at University College London, and she's author of what is known as the Sullivan Review of Data, Statistics and Research on Sex and Gender, and also by Robin Carling, who is a social worker in practice with a local authority in England. And Robin has his own Substack where he writes about issues of evidence of sex and gender in social work. So Alice's significant record of research and publications are too many to cover in a brief introduction, but they are, for anybody who looks, impressive evidence that she was exactly the right person to lead this important government commissioned review that we're going to hear about today. So I'm going to invite Alice to tell us about the review before we go on to discuss its particular relevance to social work. And Robin has prepared some questions and topics for the discussion that we hope will help listeners understand the relevance of to policy and practice in their work in particular. So before we go into the discussion, I want to welcome Alice. Thank you very much for joining us and doing this. And over to you to tell us about the review.
Thank you, Maggie. So yeah, just in a nutshell, the reason why the review was commissioned was essentially that there's been this loss of data on sex, not just in government, but across a range of organizations. And so there was concern about that in government and among stakeholders, because obviously sex is a really important variable for a host of different reasons. Alongside that, there was also a lot of interest in collecting data on gender identity or transgender status, but also question marks about how best to do that as well. And throughout all of this, I have said that, we should be collecting data on both of those things. It's not a zero-sum game. We can do both. The important thing is that we're clear about what collecting data on and that we don't muddle these two things together, because that doesn't get us clear data on either. So the terms of reference for the review was to identify trends and obstacles to accurate data collection on sex and on gender identity, and then to provide clear guidance for how to collect data on sex and gender identity. And just to kind of briefly say why accurate data matters, I think people understand that accurate data is really important for research. But it's not just for research, it's also for equalities monitoring, it's for service provision and care. So we would think of the health service as a particularly obvious example where if if your practitioner doesn't know what sex you are, then that could be really dangerous. And then it's also very important for safeguarding. Um, and one very unexpected finding for me from the review was that I received whistleblower testimony from people who told me about cases of very young children, including infants, who'd had the sex on their NHS record changed by parents for no medical reason, and that was one recommendation that should cease. That was acted on immediately by Wes Streeting. So it just kind of shows you that the implications of inaccurate data collection go beyond what you might imagine. So what we did briefly for the review was we carried out a review of data collection policies, guidance, data sets, and statistics to find out what was going on. We also reviewed questions that were being used on gender identity, carried out interviews with stakeholders, primarily people within government departments, but also beyond that. We also did a public call for evidence so that members of the public could submit examples where they thought data collection on sex and gender was going wrong. and then importantly commissioned a legal opinion from a top legal expert in the field, because actually legal misinformation has been and legal confusion has been a key factor in the decline of data collection on sex. So, and then just finally, in a nutshell, what did we recommend? Organizations should collect sex by default. They should collect data on transgender status as a distinct variable, and they should never try to somehow combine those two variables into one, because that does not work. So that's the kind of quick and dirty version, just to get you started.
Right, thanks very
So,
much. Sorry, yeah, Robin, I was just going to hand over to you to get going.
no, that's absolutely fine. So, obviously, a lot of this hinges on the distinction between sex and gender
Mm.
identity. And I think for a lot of people, there is a confusion around these terms because for a long time, gender just was a polite alternative to the term sex, but that's not how it's been used in the surveys and data collection that you found. Is that right? And can you explain a little bit about how it's actually being used?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So until the 1990s, within data collection, we collected data on sex and we called it sex. And it was binary variable with response categories, which would typically be labeled male and female. So what started to happen in the 90s was that people started to use this word gender as a synonym for sex. But initially, it literally was just a synonym for sex. And I think it very much came in as an Americanism. You may have noticed that Americans almost always say gender when they mean sex. So even Donald Trump, um, famously declaimed that there are only two genders. And, you sort of want to shake him and say, well, I think you mean two sexes. Um, so it was partly, I think, American squeamishness about the word sex, and partly a sort of academic thing. Somehow gender sounds a bit more academic. It didn't really matter because until around the 2010s and particularly around 2015, when people started using the word gender to mean something else entirely, which was gender identity. Um, so at that point, we really started losing data on sex because people were asking questions that they were calling gender, but they really meant gender identity. And so throughout that period, we've seen a real decline in the use of the word sex. And a change in what the word gender means to people. So one of the recommendations of the review is that we should just never use this word gender in data collection. When it first started happening, it probably didn't matter that much because it was just a synonym for sex. But now the word gender can mean several different things, including gender identity, and that's just very unhelpful. In data collection, we should only ever use words which have one clear meaning. So if we're collecting data on sex, we should call it sex. And if we're collecting data on transgender status, then we need to use clear terms to describe that as well.
Because my impression when reading the review was that actually a lot of the people designing the surveys weren't particularly clear on what they meant by either
Mm.
term themselves and were just as subject to the sort of confusion around these terms as anyone else. Um, how did that sort of develop? How have we gotten to a place where we don't really know what the data we're collecting is means?
That's a good question. I think it's this has happened in so many organizations. Um, there's been pressure from activists. I think that's a very important part of the story. So activists claiming that somehow it would be inappropriate or disrespectful to transgender people to record their sex or even to ask them their sex. Um, and at the same time, there's been misinformation. So legal misinformation, I think, has been a key point that's led some organisations to believe that there might be a legal problem with asking people their sex. Now, there isn't. It is perfectly lawful to ask people their sex, and indeed, in many circumstances, there is a legal duty to ask for data on sex. For example, to uphold the public sector equality duty, if you're collecting data on sex, it needs to be sex because the protected characteristic is sex. So asking something else, that's some kind of combination of sex and gender, is not going to help you to uphold your public sector equality duty. But yeah, it's been very shocking to see how organizations have been captured by the idea that somehow it's not okay to talk about sex or to ask about sex. And the most shocking example for me was the Office for National Statistics, which a big part of the background to why the review was commissioned, I think, is because the Office for National Statistics did not get a grip on this. And so we had, in the run-up to the 2021 census in England and Wales, the Office for National Statistics suggesting guidance for the sex question, which would effectively have allowed people to answer not according to their sex, but according to their gender identity, even though they were also proposing a question on gender identity alongside that. So, notwithstanding the fact that unfortunately, it wasn't a very good question on gender identity, so the data from that are less useful than we would have hoped. Nevertheless, the approach of having a question on sex and a question on gender identity could have been ideal, but the ONS, until they were prevented by a judicial review, were planning to sort of fudge the concept of sex. So that's, the answers to how that happened, I think, are the same answers that we've seen in so many organizations. Internal activism, external activism, and the waters muddied by misinformation, including misinformation on the law.
And are there any historical comparisons in terms of a something that we're collecting data on where the definitions or the concepts underlying that data collection have just completely shifted underneath us? Is there any historical comparison that you can think of?
No. So people often will come up with arguments like, oh, well, words and definitions and categories always change in data collection because society changes. And there's a kind of a little element of truth in that, for example, if we think about race and ethnicity, certainly the categories that we've used around that in the UK have changed. But the reason for that is that society has changed. We've gone from being a society with a very small percentage of people who were not white when, and so until I think it was 1991 was the first census that actually included ethnicity as a category. But that was because it would have been less useful at a time where there were far fewer ethnic minority people. Then, of course, over time, you get immigration from different countries, different groups become important, and it's important to capture those groups. That, however, is entirely different from sex, which is not a social construct and which has not changed. The nature of sex has not changed over time. What has changed is that there's been a political movement which opposes naming sex and collecting data on sex. So, in answer to your question, no, I don't think that there is any real parallel in the history of data collection.
Yeah, the reason I asked was because as I was reading the review, it was occurring to me that there is very likely a lag in our sort of data collection processes to social changes anyway. I would imagine the demographic makeup of the country shifted prior to our data collection shifting, because it's always responsive, so it's going to be slightly delayed. And I was wondering if there was a parallel in terms of anything we could look to give us an idea of how long it takes us to catch up to those changes in terms of our data collection. But if there's no parallel, there's no parallel. One of the things that, and I appreciate actually having read the Sex and Gender Contemporary Reader as well, that you actually anticipated some of the questions I'd written down when when reading the review. But one of the things that I was thinking to is, and one of the things I think one of your critics would likely say is, things like the census inherently rely on people self-reporting their sex data anyway. So I imagine a critic or proponent of sort of gender ideology would say, well, what's the difference if we just switch to gender than sex? And how would you respond to that? And what would the answer be to that sort of challenge?
The answer is that there's a big difference between self-report, which of course in a census or in a survey, most of the data is self-report, and gender identity, which is a different concept. So if we ask people to tell us their sex, that is different from asking them to tell us how they identify in terms of gender. Now, it may well be true that if we ask people to tell them our sex, that some people won't respond accurately because that's not how they identify. But it would be, it's unheard of in data collection to say, well, some people will give us inaccurate data, therefore let's not ask them to give us accurate data. And if we think in terms of race, for example, there are famous examples of people who have identified outside of their actual race. So there was a woman called Rachel Dolezal in the US who identified as black, although she was white. Now, she may well have given the wrong answer when asked what her race is, but that doesn't mean that the response to that is to say, instead of asking people, please tell us your ethnic group, to say, please tell us which ethnic group you self-identify with, or some kind of verbal construction that says that we're looking for something other than the actual information. And there is a distinction that's very well understood in social science between objective information and how people identify. Sometimes we aren't interested in how people identify. And if we take social class, for example, there's a well-established question in the British Social Attitudes Survey that says, what's something like, what social class do you identify with, or how, how would you describe yourself? And the interest in that question is that we also ask people what their occupation is and work out how they would be identified in terms of a standard social class schema, in terms of the work that they do. And then you can compare and you can say, okay, how many people, that it turns out there's lots of people who identify as working class who probably wouldn't be classified that way in terms of their work. And that's interesting. But it's interesting because you've got both pieces of information. You would never just say, all we need to know is how people identify, and we don't actually need to know what job they do.
Well, that sort of starts to bleed into one of the other things I was going to ask that you did address in the review, but I think it would be useful for the listeners, which is, what's wrong with asking a question on gender, a question on whether that aligns with the biological sex, such is this different from the sex you were assigned at birth? All the caveats that come with using that term, and then just reverse engineering sex from there. Would that not make people feel more comfortable, or would that not be more inclusive?
Well, no, for me, inclusive language is clear language that everybody can understand. And there's a number of problems with doing things in that rather convoluted way. There are kind of straightforward objections to it, such as if if you want to engineer something as basic as the sex variable out of two much more difficult questions, you're going to get missing data on both of those questions. And if you have missing data on either of them, you won't be able to derive the sex question for people who either have haven't answered, or a lot of people might get it wrong because the language is tricky. We saw in the census that there was a question about whether people identify with the sex that they were registered or assigned at birth, and that question led to problems because it's difficult language, and people, particularly people from immigrant backgrounds, or who were non-graduates, etc., some of them got that question wrong, and that is not their fault. That's the fault of the people who put in a question that wasn't in clear enough language to be understood by everybody, and that is what inclusive language is to me. A further problem, I think, with doing things that way is that essentially what you're trying to do is not ask sex directly, so it's sort of hidden, the fact that you're trying to ask sex, and then and then you can kind of infer it from what people have said on two other questions. Now, I don't think that that's quite ethical, because if we actually want to know people's sex, we should ask them directly. And if they don't want to tell us, then they have that right. Not within the census. Of course, the census is different. You have to answer all the questions. But most of the time, if you're doing a survey, for example, you ask someone their sex, they can say, no, I don't want to tell you that. And it should be absolutely obvious that you're asking them their sex. It shouldn't be somehow hidden or done in a slightly sneaky way.
It does inherently have a sort of unethical feel, as if you're trying to
Mm,
sort of manipulate data out of people rather than ask it directly. One of the things linked to this, when you're talking about people who English isn't their first language or may sort of struggle with the convoluted language of these, is the way in which that actually impacts on the data, and it's sort of self-evident once you explain it. Well, that's not what self-evident means. So it's evident once you explain it, but it's not intuitive that actually small amounts of misregistered data for the majority has a huge ripple effect on sort of how we might register the numbers of people who are trans identified. Could you sort of explain that a little bit?
absolutely. So this is a classic problem when you're trying to identify very tiny populations. So the estimate that we have for people who identify as transgender in England and Wales, whether it's right or wrong, it's 0.5%. So it's 0.5% of people. That's a tiny, tiny group of people, which implies that 99.5% of people do not identify as trans. Now, the ONS were very focused on making sure that they had a question that was acceptable to that very small population. And they were not focused on whether the remaining population, so the 99.5% of people, actually understood the question. And the problem there is that if you have false positives from the vast majority population, they can easily swamp the actual population that you're interested in. So if 1% of people don't understand the question, then that's going to be a bigger group of people than the 0.5% of people who you're actually interested in. So it doesn't take a very high proportion of people to misunderstand the question and give you a false positive to render the data actually meaningless, because what we're interested in first and foremost isn't just a population estimate, so how many people identify as transgender. We want to be able to say things about them, otherwise it's useless. So we want to be able to say things like, where do they live, and are they male or female, and what ethnic group are they, and so on and so forth. Because we collect data for all sorts of purposes, including in terms of the census, service provision. So you want to know where people live so that you can make sure the services are there for them. So if you think that there's large numbers of transgender people living in Tower Hamlets, and that they're actually more likely to be living in Tower Hamlets than in Brighton, then that has real consequences. And that's, of course, exactly what happened.
That strikes me as particularly pertinent at this moment in time when they're restructuring gender identity services from the Tavistock in London to sort of opening up these 5 centres across the country. If they don't have an accurate representation of sort of trans identified people, then how are they going to accurately establish those services to meet the needs that are present in the right locations? It strikes me that it would be a massive barrier.
Right. So that's why it's really important. And I believe it is really important that we have accurate data on transgender people. Um, as I've said throughout, this isn't a zero-sum game. It's not either sex or transgender status. We need both, and we need clear and accurate questions on both, which are well understood. On sex, it's very easy. The question, "What is your sex?" with the response categories female and male, has been used for a very, very long time, and we simply need to revert to that. Obviously, with gender identity, it is more difficult. There's a number of different questions that have been used. A lot of organisations would typically default to using the ONS question under normal circumstances, but that's actually been trying to remember what the right word is. Sort of decommissioned is not the right word, but it's been found wanting by the Office for Stats Regulation, and so it's been that's no longer the question that's recommended, and the data has been, classified as less accurate on that basis. And so we do now need to think about exactly how are we going to ask about transgender people. And the key thing that I've recommended in my report is that organizations need to know what is it that you're actually trying to find out here, before they ask the question. And I've suggested 3 different targets that might reflect what you're looking for. One is the protected characteristic under the 2010 Equality Act, and that's gender reassignment, which clearly refers to transsexual people. And if you're collecting data for the purposes of upholding the public sector equality duty, then that would be what the target of your question is. It might be something like simply, "Are you transgender?" which is roughly what the Scottish census asked, which was a much more successful question than the England and Wales question, because obviously it's much harder to get wrong or to misunderstand. Or it might be something broader. If you're, for example, if you were interested in youth identities and trends in gender identity, you might want to know not just whether people identify as transgender, but for example, also whether they identify as non-binary. Some people identify as non-binary, and transgender, and some just as non-binary and not as transgender. So if that's what you're interested in, you need a broader question. But the starting point, I would say to anybody is, and this is so obvious, but there's something about gender that tends to make people forget everything they've ever known. But it's so obvious, but you just need to stop and think, why are we asking this question, and what is it we actually want to know?
Yeah, because um, it it strikes me that there are a lot of our conversation at the moment has been on sort of collection in terms of censuses and sort of larger population data, but on an organizational level, everyone is bound by the same data protection rules, which are very clear about it has to have a purpose, it has to
Yeah.
sort of be reasonable for you to hold it for a sort of set period of time. how can organizations, just in terms of their basic data, say for local authority, what recommendations would you make for social workers in trying to make sure they're capturing accurate data that is also useful both in the practical day-to-day sense and for tracking trends and keeping track of these populations?
Right. So for operational data collection, I think clearly you need to have data on sex, and that's very straightforward and just needs to be done accurately. When it comes to gender identity, again, it's about thinking about what is it that you need to record. Obviously, if, for example, you're interacting with a young person and they are questioning their gender identity, there may well be a valid reason for recording that in a social work setting, and then that's what you need to consider. What is it exactly? What is exactly the information that you need to record? Bearing in mind that that's unlike sex, which is something you can have on record and then just keep that on record forever because it's not going to change. Um, Gender identity is different. So it is more complex, it is more difficult, and organizations need to understand that.
So it strikes me that I can see from my own practical experience that there has been a great deal of confusion and I would say safeguarding concerns raised by the sort of arbitrary, not arbitrary as such, but having a lack of clear policy on this that means that someone's name and sex are sort of changed on a system, for example, and then you lose the ability to follow them up. And you also, one of the things that really has struck me from a safeguarding perspective is every time there is any sort of rapid review or serious case review, they change the names of them every so often, but basically a review of a serious incident where a child has suffered death or significant life impairing harm. Um, One of the things that always comes out of that is the need to share information between agencies. And if you make the data that you hold on someone completely malleable to their wishes, then you're going to end up in a situation where every agency has different records that don't align with each other, which is a massive barrier to information sharing from a safeguarding perspective. Um, I also imagine from your side of things, from the sort of data collection and analysis side of things, that would make it very difficult for follow up on populations in terms of understanding, say, medical studies that would look at certain clients and then look at them so far in the future. That would be near impossible. And I do believe that NHS numbers, which would be the sort of continuity in that situation, were being changed in line. Was that correct?
That's correct. And in fact, the issue with NHS numbers has been sorted for minors, but it is still an issue for adults. And in fact, it's sorted for minors in, I think in England and Wales, certainly in England, but it's still an issue in Scotland, even for minors. So, but you're absolutely right. If we change basic facts about people in their data collection that aren't changeable variables, that are things that should be constant, like the person's name, sex, date of birth, then we make data linkage impossible. And as you say, that has consequences for scientific applications where we might want to link different data sets in order to answer certain kinds of questions. And it has really clear consequences from a safeguarding point of view. Both for the vulnerable people that you might be looking after, but also if you don't know that basic information, for example, about your staff, then that's also problematic.
Yeah, and you touched on it earlier about sort of whistleblowers coming forward, and as a social worker, obviously the most shocking aspect of your review to me was seeing that a baby of a few weeks old had
Mm.
their records changed by their mother. Um, Particularly as I believe the whistleblower said that social services wouldn't take it seriously as a safeguarding
Yes.
concern.
Yeah.
Was that an isolated incident as far as you're aware, or did you have more people coming forward with similar concerns?
No, I'm aware of a handful of incidents, and I tend to think that if you hear about a handful of incidents on something like that, well, there will be more out there. Um, because I didn't call out for people to come to me with that kind of information. It wouldn't have occurred to me to. I was deeply shocked by it. It wasn't the kind of information I was expecting to receive as part of the review. So it's deeply shocking because, of course, we all know there's always going to be a small proportion of parents out there who are abusive, disturbed, for whatever reason, do bad things. But the idea that a GP would go along with that is deeply shocking in itself. And then when it's flagged as a concern, that it went nowhere. Um, and that's, I think, symptomatic of the way in which this particular issue of gender identity makes people throw all their usual rules out of the window, in a way that's incredibly harmful, particularly incredibly harmful to vulnerable people.
Yeah, and that was something that was also highlighted in the CAS review, that gender was treated with sort of exceptionalism,
Mm,
that meant that normal practice was very much abandoned. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but there was a court case in 2016 known as Re J about a young boy whose mother, I can't remember his age off the top of my head. I think he was about 5 or 6, whose mother was um, getting him to live as a girl and stating that he wanted to be a girl. And when social care looked into it, a judge actually ruled that he'd suffered significant emotional harm as a result of his mother's actions, and was removed from her care, at which point he reverted to living as a boy completely
mm.
happily, even though they did full assessments of the father whose care he ended up in, and saw no sign that father would sort of impose his views on gender or sort of have any rigid gender concepts that he would want to push on his child. He was very open to the idea that they may want to present as a girl, but they reverted naturally. So when it comes to safeguarding, these may not be the most common things, but we are going to be dealing with the exceptionally rare cases,
Mm.
and we have to be alert to that. And it seems like this exceptionalism has made people somewhat blind to those things that we need to be most alert to.
That's fascinating. I didn't know about that case. And it's interesting that in 2016, that clearly was dealt with appropriately, and then perhaps subsequently, it might not have been.
Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
sorry. Yeah, just on that, I think that's what the question that I was going to bring up at this point is who guards the guards when we talk
Mm,
about safeguarding, because although there are instances of parents transitioning their children and having a completely their own view and being able to do it, one of the things that I've certainly been very concerned about is that a lot of the harms are being done in care to children by
mm.
policies that actually um, encourage children to believe they could belong to the different sex, be in the wrong body. The Care Inspectorate in Scotland and CAFCAS in England do actually promote those ideas very strongly and have sort of sanctioned and promoted gender ideology. So I suppose one of the questions in my mind is what, and managers have allowed or promoted this in across social care. So I suppose one of the question I had in terms of who guards the guards is what should managers have regard to, and what are the important rules, if you like, about their data, like the data that's collected about children in care, the workforce, and other things. What would you expect to see in a really robust, good, accurate data collection service.
That's a fascinating point, Maggie. I read a report recently about the experience of transgender students, and was really shocked by the huge proportion of transgender students who were care experienced. But what you've just said there might provide the clue to why that might be. So, and so I'm sorry to turn a question back on you, but what do you think the practices are specifically in care that in care settings that are making that happen?
Well, in Scotland, the Care Inspectorate's advice to providers of care across this private and voluntary sector and local authorities is that they should promote LGBTIYS Scotland and Mermaids, Stonewall as sources of advice for children, that they should festoon children's homes with lanyards and rainbows to make to be inclusive. So all stuff that we would regard, all any sensible person would regard as being really wrong. But that is the advice. So, and I think Kafkas in England has told uh, not the social workers, the Kafkas is the court advisory service on children and for the courts, and they've advised their workers who write reports for the courts that they should not assume that, I mean, just really bizarre things, that they should always ask a child what their gender identity is, and that they should not assume that that child is heterosexual just because they're a female attracted to girls. I mean, just really quite ludicrous things. That's their advice, and it's called some sort of tips. And we've advertised it on the website. So I suppose that's the sort of terrain, I think, and that's why children would. It's not just that very vulnerable children somehow get hold of the idea that they're trans, but they're actually being brought into. Now, I might be exaggerating the extent of it, but if that's what the official guidance is from, the regulators on both sides of the border, it's not too hard to imagine that care is actually inculcating, and it's not just that vulnerable children somehow from the ether or the internet get hold of the idea that they are transgender or non-binary, but it's actually something that's being promoted within.
Right,
Yes, so I suppose that's
right.
what
That's
my concerns are.
that's very interesting. And to answer your question in terms of what that means for data, I think it really highlights why we do need data both on sex and on transgender status. If, as seems to be the case, there are very high numbers of children in care identifying as transgender, we need data on that. We need to understand what's going on, what the trend line is, how it's affecting girls and boys, children with different characteristics, um, including, autism or other kinds of needs. All of those things are incredibly important. So, accurate data um, is even more vital when things are going wrong.
I think I was reading a report from the Policy Exchange recently called In Absentia Parentis about children in care and gender. And they basically submitted a information request, freedom of information request to all of the local authorities in England, and very few of them came back as a percentage to say that they knew how many children were experiencing this particular issue around gender identity, which
Mm,
raises a massive concern in terms of understanding and provision, and to sort of circle back to what we were speaking about previously, because it's commonplace that when sort of assessing any needs or providing any service, that we would track what the presenting issues are, whether that's domestic abuse, whether it's neglect, whether it's emotional abuse. The sort of list goes on. But in this one, because it's Well, actually, I was going to say because it's seen as more of a sort of inclusion thing only, but actually we keep demographic data on pretty much everything else as well. It's just this one thing that seems to be very poorly monitored and accounted for.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And that's clearly an example of a really important data gap.
And just to color that in a little bit more, I think that there is a echo across both the issues that you're seeing in terms of the data collectors being influenced, and you see the same thing in social care where it's activists are having an outsized say on sort of what training's provided, what resources are used, and so they get that inaccurate guidance, which probably means that many local authorities are neglecting their public sector equality duties in if not on a wholesale level, at least in certain instances.
Yes. Yeah.
So, what has the response to your review been? Obviously, you've said that West Streeting has fairly immediately implemented the halt on children changing their medical records, or sorry, their NHS number. Has there been any other response or any other action taken?
So I've been really pleased that the review has been very warmly welcomed across the political spectrum. So, as you may know, it was commissioned by the previous government, published by the current government. Um, all of the mainstream press coverage was very positive, and I was really, really pleased by that because, as you know, this is an area that can be quite tricky to talk about, and you expect sometimes some rather polarized responses, and I didn't get that, so that's really good news. Um,
They
in
exist. They're just in more fringe places.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know they exist. I know they exist online and so on, and that's fine. But it's yeah, it was very good to have a sort of clean sweep of very positive media coverage and very positive responses from mainstream politicians across the spectrum. Um, and that's really good. And I think that, it's important to celebrate that we are in a different place in this country than they are in the US, where this is such a partisan issue. Accurate data should never be seen as a partisan issue. It benefits everybody. Um, but yeah, to answer the question, things are, I think, a little bit slow and it's a little bit frustrating. Often it's because there are legacy data systems in place and it is genuinely difficult, I think, for some organizations to just jump quickly from um, from not collecting data on sex properly to doing it properly. And I know that, for example, in the NHS, there is ongoing work on how they're going to do that. And I expect to see that come to fruition, hopefully reasonably soon. Similarly, the Office for National Statistics have a work stream that's ongoing. So there is an element of frustration for me. I would like everyone to just kind of snap their fingers and kind of announce that they're going to do this. But at the same time, I do have faith that we're going to get to the right place eventually. It's just going to take longer than I might like.
That's an inherent problem with the public sector. There tends to be a lot of inertia and a lot
There's
of bureaucracy.
inertia, and then there's alongside the inertia, I think there is also still an element of fear that
Mhm.
the reason that organizations don't turn around and announce that, well, yes, we are going to do this, it's going to take a while, but this is what we're going to do, is because they know that as soon as they announce something, there's going to be grief and they'd rather not deal with that in advance. So there's still an element of fear, there's still an element of anxiety about provoking what we know are, a very, very difficult and angry and aggressive group of activists.
that strikes me as somewhat of a sort of tragedy of the commons type effect then, where if everyone were to do it at the same time, then
Yes.
there wouldn't be the thing, which would imply that really there needs to be a very clear directorate from government about what people should be. Would that be the solution?
That is, I have advocated for that, yes. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get that. So I think that's absolutely right. And we've seen the same thing with the For Women Scotland judgment in general. So For Women Scotland, in terms of data collection, spells out really, really clearly if you're collecting data on sex in order to uphold your public sector equality duty, obviously that has to mean sex. And that it's now clarified that sex for the purposes of the Equality Act means biological sex, not certificated sex. Now, what it clearly never meant was gender identity. And yet somehow we've needed this judgment to move people away from thinking that they could collect data on gender identity instead of sex. So it is a bit disappointing that organisations are being slow about that, but then we're seeing exactly the same slowness with every other aspect of the For Women Scotland judgment as as it applies to things as simple as single sex changing rooms. And I think it is exactly that process that you described, that nobody wants to be first because they know that if they're the first, they will take the brunt of the backlash, even though every organization knows that they're going to have to sort this out ultimately. Otherwise, they will face legal challenges. So yeah, it's very frustrating, and it would be nice to see more leadership from the top.
Yeah, I definitely think that it's something you don't hear of very often, but sort of institutional courage would
Mm,
is what's needed really. But institution courage tends to be quite an individual thing rather than institutional thing. It's hard to think of many examples where an institution has sort of taken that step to be first and be clear and just accept the consequences.
yeah, and every public sector organization and every quango and every government department, they all have their internal activists that they have to deal with as well. And that's a problem of society's own making. Um, we didn't used to have lots of internal activism within public sector workplaces, but we do now, and that underpins a whole lot of the problems that we have.
Am I right in thinking your review predates the For Women Scotland ruling?
Yes, yeah, that is correct. So it came out in March, and I think For Women Scotland was April. Is that right? Um, so there is an addendum to the review which explains the implications of For Women Scotland, but it doesn't change my recommendations because, of course, I was recommending that data collection should be based on biological sex. But what it does is just make it absolutely crystal clear. And it means that all the sources that people might be looking to for advice on data collection are now pointing in the same direction. And actually, there are reports that came out before my report that point in the same direction. So there was a UK Statistics Authority Inclusive Data Task Force report that said data on sex alongside other demographic characteristics should be collected by default. There is guidance from the Office for Statistics Regulation, which says that data on sex and gender identity should not be muddled together, and emphasises as well this confusing use of the term gender, which is unhelpful. Then there's my report, then there's the For Women Scotland judgment. Everything points in the same direction. It's all really simple and clear. Um, so that should make it easy for organisations because they're not dealing with a range of sources that are pointing them in different directions.
Yeah, I think that's something that comes across very clearly from what you've said today and from the report. And you said, this is not a partisan issue. This is just a clear issue of the facts. And if people, for instance, were self-reporting their age, everybody would wonder what on earth that was about. What age would you like to be? Oh, 18, 22, I'd like to be, it's obviously completely ridiculous. And it seems to me it's something to do with the fact of women and women's oppression, that they could have got away with it to that extent with something that affects women so, and children actually just as much, so strongly. But I think the message in terms of managing social work, and where really the message hasn't really got through at all, I don't think, and maybe Robin could correct me, but that it's not a partisan issue, but that we do need the actual facts. You can think what you like about gender identity and whether you've got one or you haven't got one, but what we need to
Mm.
do is distinguish between people's idea of their gender identity and their actual sex, so that we know something about what's going on there in the population. Did you have anything else to ask about, Robin, or to add? We're coming up for the hour.
No, no, I've gotten through all of my questions. Yeah, it just really helpful to sort of be able to. It's very rare that you get the opportunity to ask questions to the review as you're reading it, and so reading it and then getting to speak to you is very helpful in that regard.
Oh, that's good.
Great.
And I hope that people, Robin was very clear that social workers in practice might never have had these kind of discussions or understanding of what it is they're actually dealing with here. And we know from our members that there's a very generally there's fear, and there's an idea that you can't
Mm.
really talk about it, and people know that they can get sacked or taken to the regulator. But so there's been a real absence of this just kind of fresh air discussion about, well, what's this about? What does this mean? What does that mean? Why is it important? So I hopefully this podcast will get a hearing amongst a broader reach of social workers and allied professionals, and other people associated with the services, so that we can just get back some of that balance and get the idea that it's not partisan, it's not what tribe you're in, it's actually about
Mm.
just doing good work, getting good statistics, good figures, and being able to do the right thing for people.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that it is getting easier to talk about it. And I also hope that this topic of data collection is sufficiently kind of non-emotive, because some people do get upset about these issues. Um, but when we're talking about data, I think it should be, hopefully it's a sufficiently dry topic that people won't get too emotional, and that we can just have a calm, rational discussion and think about how to benefit everybody. And my view has always been accurate data benefits everybody, including transgender people. So this should not be a source of conflict.
Great. Well, I think we'll give you the last word on that. And thank you very much, Alice, for being taking the time to do this podcast for us, and to have given us such really good, fresh answers. And thanks to Robin as well, really good questions, and that hopefully have got us in a better place in social work, or can get us into a better place in understanding the importance of evidence in social work. So thanks very much.
Thank you for
And
having me.